Wait, you're welcome to all of you. I'm Robin Cooper. I am one of the co-founders and president of Climate Psychiatry Alliance. And before Sandra DeJong comes on to talk about these articles, I just want to set the stage. We did not plan to read these two articles with the expectation that we would be in the moment when the backdrop of what's happening in our world around climate change would be experienced right at this moment. Just a few days ago, Sunday was the hottest day ever registered in history. And we are now in many, many places experiencing again a summer of massive wildfires. So the articles that we're talking about, Sandra, I don't know if you planned it this way, but they really represent what's happening right here now. And welcome, Sandra. Please introduce yourself and others also.
Great. So my name is Sandra DeJong. I am a child psychiatrist based in Cambridge, Massachusetts at Cambridge Health Alliance and Harvard Med School. I've really been a teacher, clinical clinician, educator most of my career. I did see patients all day today. And have been active nationally and organized in national organizations, really focusing on education, but also advocacy. And was one of the founding members of the ACAP climate youth mental health youth climate health mental health group that is now, I'm happy to say, going to be made a committee, and the youth arm of CPA. So I've been working with some wonderful child psychiatrists on all of this. So why don't others go ahead? I'll bing it to Steve Peterson. How about that?
Oh, hi. Yes, it's a pleasure to. It's so exciting. I heard about this meeting and I'd already ordered the book about the firestorm. And I've gotten a little bit way through it. Just fascinating. The book just blows my mind. Maybe we should have it as a book club selection down the road. But anyway, I'm very interested in all your thoughts and presentation today. And yes, indeed, we in DC have had three of the highest heat days in late July. I mean, no, we're not there yet, but anyway, earlier this month, and we've had patients coming in who are in real jeopardy and didn't really know how serious it was, the weather, and people in their 80s who are wandering in the community in the heat and things. So yes, we really need to hear about this. Thank you.
Thanks. Bettina, are you on mic? Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I think so. Hi, so I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist. I'm in Philadelphia, and I actually do attend the climate group meetings through ACAP that you started, Sandra, which are wonderful. But I'm not really a member of the committee because I'm a member of another committee and whatever. You can only be on so many committees for ACAP. But I really think this is a hugely important issue. And in Philadelphia, we have had, like everywhere else, I guess, the hottest summer I have ever seen here. And it really does bring out all the inequities and, stresses that our families and kids have. And I also am a practicing clinical person, having finished my day today just about half an hour ago. And I'm happy to be with this group. And through this group, I think I've met a couple of people that I never met before, Steve and hopefully Robin Cooper also. So
Great.
yay.
Thank you, Janet.
I'll ping it to
who's going to pick?
Janet.
Great. Thank you.
Hi, yeah, I'm Janet Lewis. I'm on the CPA steering committee, and I'm also co-chair of the GAP Climate Committee, and I do teaching with the climate aware therapist trainings. And I'm in Central New York State. I still practice, private practice, see a variety of people, including some old order Mennonite and Amish people who are out in the heat. And many of them don't have air conditioning. So yeah, I'm so glad to be able to be here.
Thank you. How about Steve Sugden? Can you, are you able to?
Yeah, I pulled over so I could introduce myself. My name is Steve Sugden. I'm an addiction psychiatrist at the University of Utah. I have multiple interests kind of in kind of like what is that center of the Venn diagram between disaster medicine, climate medicine, and lifestyle medicine, because I think that they all impact each other. And I'm excited for this book. I'm excited to read it myself. Later, I teach a disaster preparedness course at the University of Utah and tie in climate stuff into that. And so I'm looking forward to this as another resource. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Jenna, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Jana Blomquist. I'm the CPA Membership Development Coordinator, and I'm here as the least educated of the group, but very interested in this important intersection that you all are mentioning. It's interesting being I'm in the Tahoe area in Northern California, Truckee, and it's nice here. It's beautiful here, but it is hotter than normal, and it is kind of interesting having those conversations like, oh, this is nice, but it didn't used to be. I've lived here for going on 15 years, and this is the warmest summer I've seen, even though it's not in the hundreds. So, if it's getting hot in the mountains, it's concerning. So,
yep. Couldn't agree more. And Giselle, last but not least, Giselle.
I think Giselle.
Hi, sorry, I'm here. I just had to take a second to unmute. My name is Giselle Bergmeyer, she, her pronouns. I am the CPA administrative assistant. So I'm mostly here to support with any tech needs anyone may have, but I care deeply about CPA's mission and helping to support all of you experts in these topics. I'm located in North Carolina, where currently the humidity is about 98% all the time. But this topic is of interest to me as well.
Thank you. Well, thanks everybody for joining. And I thought I would say a little bit about why I chose both this chapter 14 from John Vaillant's book and also this article. And I'm glad that Robin also pointed out where we are today, because there was a story in the New York Times today about wildfires in the American Northwest and in exactly the same place that John Vaillant wrote about in Fort McMurray, Alberta, as well as in the forests of British Columbia. So his book was written in the last couple of years, but the Fort McMurray fire that he wrote about took place in May 2016, so 8 years ago. And I was interested in part because my maternal grandmother grew up in Alberta, and I had gone back to see the small town where she grew up, and I have lots of photographs of her riding her horse to school, and the family going on picnics in the beautiful forests around there. So it's a part of the world that I care about a lot. And I have always been an admirer of the psychiatrist George Vaillant, who started this longitudinal study. It was originally the class of 1954 at Harvard, but he then sort of expanded to have control groups and to bring in women and so forth. And it's sort of a story of, how do people keep going in life? What makes them happy? And what are the keys to sort of healthy adaptation to the stressors of life? And so I was really interested to see that his son, John Vaillant, who now lives in British Columbia, had written this book, Fire Weather, and about the area where my grandmother grew up. Like Steve, I picked up this book and I couldn't put it down, really. It's such a gripping story. For those of you who don't know that part of the world, Fort McMurray, Alberta is really the hub of the oil industry in Canada. It's not great oil, to be honest. It's sort of tar sand oil. It's kind of pretty crappy oil, but a whole bunch of money has been invested in it. And really an entire town grew up around this oil. There was nothing much there before. And that town exports the most oil of anywhere to the United States. So it's the prime source of oil to the United States. And the reason I wanted you to get a sense of this book and the reason why
imports to the United States
Yep.
that are above our own drilling.
Yes.
Yes.
Whoa.
Yep.
Whoa.
Yep. So, and it's a weird place, you know, if you ever go there, it feels like something sprung up too quickly. It's not really well planned out. The quality of, you know, it sort of has a funny nouveau quality to it. It's a really weird place. But I was sort of debating what part of the book to share to give you the kind of flavor that I wanted to give you of it. And I chose chapter 14, which is really right in the middle of the book, for a couple of reasons. He spends the first part of the book building up to the fire and talking about really a day in the life of, you know, a pretty ordinary day in this town and what the sort of emergency leaders were all doing. And you kind of follow a cast of characters. But I think what you get to in chapter 14 that I really wanted to share with you is this notion that people went through this day initially completely denying that anything was wrong, completely, seeing the signs of something really bad about to happen, but not letting them register consciously on their brain. Then at the end of the day were displaced. It actually is the highest number of displaced people due to a fire in North America so far. And as John Vaillant says in his book, the ordinary was made grotesque. You know, so the images of what he saw around him was horrendously a tip, you know, sort of an everyday place, horrendously distorted. Linda, I see that you're here, and I just want you to have us. Well, I'm going to take a pause and let you introduce yourself.
I was just working on a chat while I was listening to you, so I'm happy to do it quickly, verbally, and then get back to what.
Yeah.
So I'm Linda Forsyth. I pushed return after I said hi all, so it went. All the rest of it went into the next piece. Anyway, I'm a child psychiatrist at MGH. Trained there, been there sort of forever. And I am on the Disaster and Trauma Committee for the American Association of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. We're doing a presentation at our annual meetings on green space and mental health. I'm the environmental and health or something like that liaison to that committee, and have presented particularly on things like food, green spaces, root cause resolution, trauma healing, and all ways that orients to climate. I have an outdoor office. I could go on and on, but I'll get back to what you were talking about.
And you were one of my teachers in fellowship, so.
And that's true too. I've been around a long time.
So there's a connection here.
See you.
Thank you for that. So that's part of the reason that this whole story of Fort McMurray and the fire is really a story of climate change denial, and it's sort of he uses it as a metaphor for the where we find ourselves in history right now. But the second reason, and the specific reason I wanted to include chapter 14, is that one of the things I feel strongly about as a physician is that to be involved in climate mental health is really a biopsychosocial responsibility. And we are that group of mental health professionals who are biopsychosocially trained. And so although we could spend a lot of time talking about the psychosocial impacts of fire and heat, and certainly John Vaillant does that in his book, I also feel strongly that we need to understand some of the science, both of fire and of fire itself, and also of fire and heat on the human body and the human brain. So that's why I chose these two pieces. So on pages 172 to 5, John Vaillant gives this very, I think, clear, succinct, terrifying description of how fire works from a scientific perspective. So one of the things that I had not appreciated before reading this book was that fire creates such heat, potentially, that it actually superheats the air around it, and that creates this vacuum effect so that that pulls in air. So you get, he calls it fire weather because it is in fact a whole kind of weather system unto itself. And it involves, he calls it kind of like a recirculating fountain, that you get these big movements of air. And in that system, there are some important things. One is, as he says, a colossal amount of water. So there's a huge amount of water that actually gets pulled into these systems. And the smoke, what we sort of euphemistically call smoke, is really this combination of soot, combustive gases, toxic chemicals, and steam. And it's really a lethal combination. And so these are really, we using words like fire and smoke really diminishes, I think, the power of these actual weather systems. So one of the things he talks about, which is a sort of a fascinating phenomenon, is this idea of a fireborne thunderhead, which is actually, technically, it's a pyrocumulo-omnibus cloud, or abbreviated to be PRI-CBS, PyroCBS, but it's a huge energy thing, enough that it's affected by the Coriolis effect, and he describes it as the most effective distributor of high altitude pollutants. So this is a system that can actually bring toxic stuff up, way up, and spread it really wide. The other thing that these systems generate is pyrogenic lightning. So that means that what starts as a local event spreads extraordinarily quickly to become a regional, if not larger, event. And really the take-home message here is that a big enough fire spreads itself. It doesn't need anything else to feed on, so to speak. It creates its own system of hot air that keeps spreading. So he alludes in this chapter to something called the Lucretius problem, which it's an interesting problem that I really first thought about when I was thinking about Jonathan Schell's book way back in the 90s, The Fate of the Earth, and how difficult it is and was and is for us to contemplate nuclear war, because it has not been in our experience, and it seems so huge that it's sort of unmanageable. And the Lucretius problem is really this description of the problem that we have in imagining and assimilating things that are actually outside our personal experience to date. And this is where I think reading books like Fire Weather, some of the, like, Don't Look Up, which I try to show to my students, these kinds of things help people, I think, start to appreciate and start to entertain in the realm of their own conscious imaginations how bad things can be. So that's the science of fire piece. And I really do recommend, thanks, Steve, for speaking so warmly about it. I too would really endorse reading the whole book. It's really an extraordinary story. And I'm going to take a pause here because Bob Fetter has joined. Bob, do you want to just introduce yourself? You're on mute.
Bob Fader. I'm with the CPA steering committee. I live in Hollis, New Hampshire, and was very impressed with both of the readings for tonight.
Great.
Um,
I'm sitting here in Rockingham, Vermont, Bob.
Ah,
Sandra and everyone else here, Bob has helped us to be able to imagine what we have not been able to imagine as the leader of the book club discussion of Ministry for the Future, which I have conveniently been able to say it is sci or science fiction because I can't imagine it, what is in that book or what you have just addressed, Sandra, as it is really, really hard to be able to think what could be if it hasn't been an experience that we've had. And I think for Steve, who has said that he works at the interface of disaster preparedness, the article also addresses how do you prepare for things that you can't imagine.
Yeah. So turning to the article, I thought I would just say a little bit about what I found compelling about the article, and then my thought was to leave time at the end just for an open discussion. So just maybe a quick summary here. So this is actually written by an Australian, and which I thought was interesting. And so first of all, what is extreme heat? He tries, there's no formal definition, but broadly, you can think of it as prolonged periods of temperatures of 90 degrees Fahrenheit or above, often with high humidity, or shorter periods of even higher temperatures in the 100s and so on. So why, how are we set up to deal with heat in terms of our brains? So thermoregulation is obviously an incredibly important physiologic function. It turns out it's mostly regulated by the hypothalamus, but we have temperature receptors all over our bodies. And how we respond and how the hypothalamus directs moderating that heat impact is largely through the autonomic nervous system. So our skin has receptors, our core organs, our spinal cord, and that comes up a little bit later. And so when we're faced with high temperatures, our heat dissipation system activates. We vasodilate in our skin. Our sweat glands are activated to promote perspiration and cooling through evaporation. So and it's a very delicate balance because our brains need to be at the right temperature in order to work optimally. So we don't do well if we're too cool, and we don't do well if we're too hot. It's a fairly narrow range. So what happens when the brain gets too hot? Well, it's also important to remember that neuronal activity in and of itself generates temperature increases. So when we are cognitively active and firing all those neurons, our brain temperatures actually go up, typically around 2 to 3 degrees centigrade. So how do we get rid of that increased heat? Well, it's through the cerebral circulation, so that the blood takes up the heat, it goes to our lungs and our skin, and it dissipates into the air. And so when we have extreme ambient heat in the environment, it interferes with that regulatory capacity, and we get decreased neuronal function and potentially really life-threatening complications. So what kinds of neural activity are dependent on appropriate temperatures? Well, very relevant to psychiatry, the uptake of dopamine, the synthesis and release of serotonin, the impact of mitochondria and plasma membranes. So as I think we all know, mitochondria are becoming, clearly increasingly important in neuropsychiatric disorders. There's also disruption of the endothelial cells and the blood-brain barrier. And another area that's really opening up, reduced functioning of the glial cells, which have become, just in the last 10 to 15 years, implicated in all kinds of psychiatric disorders. So that's the heat issue with the brain. let me talk a little bit I'm going to follow his sort of outline here, so about wildfire smoke. So the first thing is just, of course, as we all know, wildfires are up. They're up, expected to be increased another 14% by 2030, another 30% by 2050, and another 50% by the end of the century. So nobody is forecasting that they're going to decrease. The smoke, wildfire smoke in and of itself is a major form of air pollution. But as I alluded to, it has these very, complicated and disparate ingredients. So water vapor, coarse and fine particulate matter, which is mostly carbon, volatile compounds like aldehydes, and then gases, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, and heavy metals, including arsenic. So this is a pretty toxic mix. And I just want to explain about particulate matter because it turns out it does matter. So typically particulate matter is abbreviated as PM. If you see PM10, for example, that means that it's particulate matter with an average diameter of 10 micrometers. If you see PM25, it's 25 micrometers in diameter. The other thing, of course, about wildfire smoke is that it rarely occurs in a vacuum, right? It enters cities like New York City that are already polluted, right? So there are already all kinds of toxins in that, pre-existing air pollution in the area. And it's particularly complicated when wildfires occur at what's called the wildland-urban interface, or WUI. That's actually an incredibly important concept and one that people who manage fire disasters are very familiar with, and that town planners and so forth think about, because of the how quickly fires can spread at that interface. In terms of smoke and the brain, so it actually, there's a lot of evidence to show that wildfire smoke is actually more toxic to the brain than just air pollution alone. And that's primarily because of the inflammatory response and oxidative stress response. So for those of you who haven't, like me, been recently reading about oxidative stress, that's what happens when we have too many free radicals in our system, those molecules that we really need to try to get rid of, but we need enough antioxidants to get rid of them. And if we don't have enough, these toxic free radicals can, roam around our brains and our bodies. And what they do is really damage cells, damage protein, and damage DNA, all of which contributes to illness and aging. The toxins that are or the toxicity of the smoke varies on the kind of vegetation that is being consumed by the fire. And it's believed that the matter reaches the brain in two ways. One is through the olfactory system, so up through the nose and the cribriform plate into the brain that way. And the other is through the lungs and the bloodstream. Particulate matter can cross the blood-brain barrier, and it does compromise the blood-brain barrier as well. So that's important to remember. The inflammatory response is really systemic. So once this matter starts to enter our lungs and our bloodstream, we get a full-blown inflammatory response. And as we know, inflammation can be helpful when it's appropriately harnessed to address pathogens in the human body, but it can also get out of control. And that is one of the real problems that we have with smoke. So what does the smoke and the particulate matter, how does it affect brain functioning? Well, it affects microRNAs and gene regulation. It can affect, particulate matter can affect the signaling process in the brain, and including, very relevant to psychiatry, the BDNF pathways. So you remember that's brain-derived neurotrophic factor, very critical in the pathology of the physiology of depression. GABA is affected by particulate matter in animals. It hasn't yet been demonstrated in humans. There's also an impact on autophagy, or the sort of the healthy sort of garbage collection that macrophages and other cells in the inflammatory system do in clearing up unwanted matter. And so that is affected, and they're sort of basically trash accumulates in our brains because that function is not up to snuff. And then it's also associated with the microvasculature. So there's an association between particulate matter and strokes, particularly ischemic strokes. So what about heat and the inflammatory processes? So neuroinflammation affects the microglia, the astrocytes, the cytokines, all, and it's absolutely critical in combating heat. But as I was alluding to, when it's excessively activated, it can contribute to neurodegenerative processes like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. These also affect the hippocampus, which we all know is critical in learning. And there's something called heat shock factors, which are proteins that respond to heat, and they are important in protein folding and aggregation, but their functioning is impaired in response to heat and smoke. So with smoke and inflammation, we see an increase in apoptosis in the endothelial cells of the lung. And we see this oxidative toxicity and inflammation affecting some regions of the brain more than others. So that's a sort of an interesting area of potential research. There's impaired integrity of the blood-brain barrier, and there's also fluctuations in neutrophils peripherally as well as impact centrally. We were alluding to earlier the impact of heat on cognition and heat stress on cognition, and there's very clear evidence that heat does impact attention and concentration, working memory, psychomotor performance, decision-making. We know that the elderly and young children are the most vulnerable. And there's this phenomenon called neurovascular coupling, which is the idea that when we are in heightened neural activity, our blood flows to that region, which is why you can see all those studies on functional, MRIs that show increased blood flow in those areas of the brain that are being used. Well, of course, when we heat up, that blood goes peripherally, right? It goes to our dilated peripheral vessels, and it diverts the blood away from our brain. And that's why we are functioning less well cognitively. So there's kind of a functional oxygen deficit as neuronal activity increases, with therefore an increased energy demand while the blood's being diverted away. There are also probably secondary effects, like we know that people are uncomfortable, they don't sleep as well, and that probably also has a role as well. And then we know that, so we think that it's probably a combination of both of those things, I guess. In terms of wildfire smoke and cognition, we know that particulate matter in and of itself is a risk factor for impaired cognition, and it's elevated in dementias. We also have evidence that wildfire smoke decreases attention in adults. And there is also, in the setting of people exposed to wildfires, chronic symptoms of PTSD, anxiety, and depression, all of which, as we know, have a negative impact on concentration and memory. And in fact, those people who have had a direct fire exposure recently clearly demonstrate trauma and cognitive deficits associated with that. I want to say a little bit more about heat stress and dementia. So these heat waves, of course, are also complicated because they are associated with social isolation, lack of access to resources, reduced mobility, tech doesn't work as well, communication problems. And so for somebody who you can imagine as an elderly patient who has maybe mild dementia, who may also have, compromised cerebrovascular status and respiratory illness, is then psychosocially going to be further at risk because of all of these other factors. And no big surprise, it turns out that during these heat waves, hospital admissions go up, right? We do know that that things are worse for people who are on certain medications, and it's so critical that we train psychiatrists to be more aware. I will say I was at a meeting recently reviewing an article about, the impact of heat on psychotropic medications. And a mid-career psychiatrist said, "Oh, I had no idea." And I just think we're not getting the word out enough. And with dementias, of course, the cholinesterase inhibitors are just another part of the problem. So there's been some interesting studies looking, for example, in Mexico City, they did a study of brains of people who are deceased and who had lived in the city, and found an increased concentration of amyloid beta peptides in their brain. There has been a study, a 2023 study in this country, showing a strong association between agricultural and wildfire smoke and incident dementia here. So that relationship is getting to feel more and more robust. So we've talked about heat, we've talked about smoke, and one of the sort of briefer sections of the paper is the potential synergistic effects between the two. And I think this is actually a really interesting area and one we need much more research on. But the author sort of hypothesizes about some potential mechanisms. One would be the inflammatory response, which occurs in the face of both heat and smoke and particulate matter. The disruptions to the blood-brain barrier, which happens with both. And then very importantly, neurodevelopment. We know that there is an increased risk of fetal abnormalities when pregnancies occur in high temperatures. And of course, that raises all kinds of issues. We don't know much about things like what makes one individual more susceptible than another, how genes and individual sort of genotypes have an impact, nor do we know much about climate and gut-brain axis. Of course, we know that that's another area that's really developed in the last 20 years in psychiatry, but that's, I think, a potential area as well, as he points out. And finally, I'll just end that he really, one of the things I liked about this article is that he underscores the need for health professionals to be working with scientists, with policymakers, with community folks, because the potential solutions, there's no one solution, right? This is really a biopsychosocial problem, and it needs all of those factors to be addressed in terms of the mitigating approaches. So I'll stop there and I'm really eager to hear, hopefully you enjoyed the article and the chapter, and I'm really eager to hear your thoughts.
There's one concept that I really love. It's the eco-biopsychosocial paradigm that we seem to be needing to move to. And it's not my idea. It's a great idea, though. Yeah. Thank you. Wonderful to talk. Thank you.
Sandra, I think you just did an extraordinary summary of for both articles, particularly the White article, which is, I think, a very complicated article because it is new science about the mechanisms of how air pollution, wildfire smoke, and heat impact behavior and thinking and regulation of thought and mood. But I thought what was drilled down in this article was his really significant overview of the mechanisms that might underlie that. That, of course, challenged my cognitive capacities, but I thought it was extremely interesting and added a great deal of depth. One of the things that he points out in that article, which I had no idea about, is that actually the type of biomass of the particular trees varies in terms of its toxicity. And that was just a completely new idea for me. Of course, both of these articles stimulate and bring up additional questions. How do we manage it? Who are the other populations at risk? The chapter 14, Vaillant, is that how you pronounce his name?
Vaillant, yeah.
I thought his description of how weather is created by fire was he makes it very visual.
Yep.
So hard ideas can be seen. And I thought the way he made analogies to the experience of these mega fires being of biblical proportion,
Yep.
and that the analogies to what what is in the Bible was quite compelling. I also his description of the experience of being in that fire made the statistics really very palpable. Oh my God, my car could run out of gas, or my EV. Oh my God, the roads, people are going too slow, and the fire is going too fast.
Or not moving because the roads are all blocked.
I mean, we've all been stuck in traffic jams. I could put myself in a state of terror with those descriptions. These were very complimentary, and I also want to thank you for such an incredible summary of the White article that is so complicated.
Thanks. Yeah, I will say that one of the things that the Vaillant book really made clear to me is that we have to find a way to reach people. And the way he does it is through this it's a story. It's a highly dramatic story into which he has embedded a ton of information.
Yep.
And I think it's just, that's what we need to be doing is telling stories. And they're not made up.
Sorry, I remember during the days when we were all terrified of nuclear war. I think it was in the 50s. The people didn't really get it, but then there was a program put out that showed what happened to a town, just as you were just describing, Robin. It happened to a town. What happened if the nuclear bomb went off right nearby, and what happened to the people in the story. And they showed it all across America. Somehow they were able to do it. I don't know how politically, but anyway, the bottom line is after that, the really true anti-nuclear movement started. So I'm wondering if we could maybe have a movie kind of like The Fire Weather that Vaillant wrote to describe what happened, and that would really grip people, and people, I guess they have what is it when you Schadenfreude? They love to see other people getting hurt and stuff. Well, a lot of people would go to that movie, you know? So I was thinking maybe that might be a way to get the word out anyway, in this day and age where people don't do much more than go to movies.
Cli-Fi does have a really important role here. Yeah, thank you for that wonderful summary. I was finding myself thinking, oh, I'm so glad this is being recorded to be able to refer back to. I read the paper. I haven't yet read the chapter, but the importance of the stories, I think, we just can't overstate this. There is research on the ways we think about the future, and the neural pathways for thinking about the future are pretty much the neural pathways for thinking about the past, for memory. I mean, they're pretty much the same, and it's thought that what the mind does is cobble together things from the past to be able to think about the future. I mean, which makes sense, but then what if we're headed into novel futures? So this is so this is so essential, these narratives. I look forward to reading the chapter.
Yeah, I was impressed with White's paper about what toxic bombs wildfires are. There's just so much bad stuff there, not only coming from the different tree species, but all the stuff that was in the homes that get consumed and kind of blow up. All the toxic materials that were being stored in garages and in houses. You just don't want to be anywhere near these things, and it's pretty impossible to avoid them when everything drifts westward from where the fire is. After reading the Vaillant article, I was inspired to look back up more things about the Fort McMurray fire. I had vaguely remembered it. It happened a fairly long time ago in 2016. It was one of the first major forest fires in North America, and some pretty remarkable things about it. If you look at the map of Alberta and what part of the fire Alberta was destroyed by that fire, it doesn't look all that impressive, but you forget how big Alberta is. And then I kind of zoomed around, and that fire took out an area about the size of Connecticut and Rhode Island combined. It was just immense. And there's a fire going on right now, not too far from that just
Yep.
took out half the town of Jasper,
Yep.
Alberta.
Yeah.
And it's a problem that is only getting worse and is very, very frightening.
And Bob, I'm glad you mentioned the destruction of toxic contents of buildings and homes and so forth. In Vaillant's book, he walks you through. I have to admit, it was excruciating to read because you meet these people early in the book as they're kind of getting up in the morning and starting to go about their day. And then by the end of the day, he gives you the minutiae detail of what, how their homes blew up, were consumed by the fire, and what was in them and how that contributed to the toxicity of the fire. And it's really tough read. I found it very tough reading, but it made it very real.
He also said that certain kinds of trees actually almost blow up. They've got so much volatile sap. And I found out we're replanting DC, and along the roadway in front, they have the same kind of trees. There's some that are protective, and the indigenous people used to put them around their fishing camps and things in the summer because they knew that aspens wouldn't burn, for example.
Right.
And other trees, but the black locust, I think he said, or black ash, had a lot of volatile. Oh my God, there's a bunch of them in front of my house.
Oh God. Yeah. Well, this wildlife urban margin, where that I alluded to, actually, if you look up, for example, fire safety in the state of Vermont, the state has done a great job of trying to explain the importance of maintaining an adequate barrier. And yet, one of the things that happened in Fort McMurray was that it was a town that developed very, very quickly. It was sort of a boom town around the oil industry, and people disregarded all of the guidelines, right? And so it was just a disaster waiting to happen.
I actually, as we talked about this idea of not being able to imagine the future because we think about it in terms of our own experiences, I think that this is a conundrum about making sure that your perimeter to your house is cut back, and we're all, we've trimmed out the trees and re-landscaped. But it may be, I think it's necessary, but it may be also fooling us because the fire that was described and these big mega fires, you can't stop them. And that's a challenge about this wildland urban interface. It's not just the building materials, which are of course concerning, but that's where populations are. And that's where many elderly actually retire because they're affordable, or at least that's been true in some of the big fires in California. Just another heartbreak when people lose everything.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think it's true when, as I meant, as I said, and I think Vaillant captures this so well, is that once a fire gets big enough, it develops a life of its own. And that's the bottom line, and you can't stop it. But I do think there's a lot that can be done to try to prevent it from getting to that size. And that's why I think it's still worth it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it was a miracle in that Fort McMurray fire. Only 2 people died, and
Yeah.
they died in a car crash, not really from the fire. And they did an incredible job of evacuating 90,000 people in time.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
It is amazing. It's
That's-
interesting that the chief, I think it was the chief of the fire department, was doing a radio show, and he thought thousands had died when he was interviewed on the radio, and it was before he had the data yet. And he was just, choking up and unable to talk. And when he hears that only 2 people died, and actually it wasn't directly due to the fire, I mean, he thinks it's just a miracle. He just can't even believe it. Yeah.
There's a concept in some of my work called a trauma vortex, where everything that happens makes everything that happens worse, which of course makes everything that happens worse. And it really speaks, I think, to what you're talking about, the life of its own, and that, prevention and early recognition and all that kind of stuff at so many levels is so key. The other fun part for me with all of this, I stumbled into you guys because I had a different meeting planned and I had to go catch the Zoom, and it was canceled. And then there was Liz Pinsky's, and it said, I know it's already started, but, and so I did not read, but I have my own history with this, because my son, who lives in Bozeman, Montana, when he first went to Bozeman, he worked on a fire watch. He wasn't going into the flames or anything like that, but he was at the towers or something on a fire watch, and totally new concept for him, although he's always loved the outdoors. And it was just a seasonal job to be able to move into the area with his buddies from college, but he learned a lot. And so he and I have had conversations about it. I don't know if he knows about this book, but of course I'll loop back.
Yeah.
But it reminds me of other pieces that connect with some of what you all were saying. And that is the, as I'm working from sort of my climate side, which is touches on much of this, but doesn't focus exactly on this. We try to figure out how to get the word out. How do we get it to the younger generation? How do we help the younger generation know that the older generation cares? Because there's this sort of floating idea that, the older ones left all of this to the younger ones and so on. Anyway, and that is that to help it not just be an item of science, but help it get into the English classes, so that people are doing the work to get their heads around these complicated issues and organize, just what you're learning even in essay writing. And so the fun thing there is that, and of course, philosophy, you guys have made reference to, how do you even think beyond what you've experienced? And so I was a philosophy major in college, so all of this I just love. But my son, who was also a philosophy major and an English major, actually went to college to do the soundtracks for movies. And so he's like, he didn't end up staying that way. He took a turn, but he's very much about the story, and very much about the fires, and very much about the land, and very much, da 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 da. So I will loop back to him. Who knows? Maybe he'll write a song. He's in a band. Maybe he'll write a song, and it'll start to
Linda,
take fire, so to speak.
Linda, you and I have things we have to share. My daughter lives in Missoula. Her ex-partner was a hotshot wildfire fighter. I know a lot about the wildland firefighters.
Wow,
In
yes.
that community. Your stuff to share, and your son might be interested in Bob Fetter's encore performance of the book, My Ministry of the Future.
So I don't know about that either. As I said, I stumbled. I'm going to tell him all the pieces. That Ministry of the Future is a movie. It's a what is it?
Sci-fi that Bob has led our discussion in the book club. And Steve, I could not tolerate that being put into a film. I would have to close my eyes.
Yeah, well, but I think, one of my personal biases about we need to alert everybody and I'm going to exaggerate to make my point, and scare everybody and send their heads all into the sand because we, just say it's all over now. And the way the autonomic nervous system is, it doesn't exactly just process that and then make the next plan. It goes into sympathetic, or as we're learning from polyvagal theory, I don't know if that's something you all know about, but we also kind of go into immobilization if mobilizing doesn't solve the problem. And I fear, in a healthy way, I call it a challenge, not a threat, but that our presentation matters, because what we want to do, I think, is help people make relationships with nature and the planet, and feel an invitation in, as opposed to what you say very clearly, we could just get shut down. And I think so a lot of what I do is working with communities to do these, invite. And I'm literally working on well, I don't have to go into detail. Anyway, yes, Robin, it'd be really fun.
So maybe I'll close this out just by saying, I think this is a both and in every way. So I really believe we need to tell the stories. We need to think about it in English, philosophy, science, geography, history, you name it. I think
Psychosocial. Yep.
it has to be exactly. But as I said at the beginning of tonight's, session, I don't hear psychiatrists talking about the neuroscience of climate change and its impact on the brain. And if we're not talking about it, I worry that nobody's talking about it. So I really want us to integrate that into everything else that is also so important.
And I'm going to just take the final and first, Linda, you gave a perfect way of giving us the way to say goodnight to each other by indicating that how we tell the story matters.
Yeah.
And I want to thank you, Sandra, for telling us this in such a powerfully wonderful way, integrating really complex ideas with also things that touch the heart, and compelling ideas about the and the but, and that there are ways for us to integrate this complex material and use it in important ways. And I thank you, Sandra, for the way you have done this for us tonight.
My pleasure. Thanks all for joining. It's been fun.